you, Pierre Benoit. If you stop sharing your screen, then we can all see each other a bit better. Excellent. Okay, and so if all the panelists will turn on their cameras, Benham, talking to you. Excellent. Okay, we can see you. All right, so now we can have a bit of a discussion. So I'm going to ask some questions, and I want all of you to feel free to jump in, and then we'll open it up to the panel. And if the panel runs out of some questions, we can take some from the larger public who's watching as well. Okay, so I want to explore a little more about this idea that a number of you mentioned about power relations associated with technology, and especially with nuclear technology. I think it's really important in trying to understand how technologies fit and work in society to surface those hidden power relations. And so I want to talk a bit more about where that power is located and who benefits from that power. And so, Sheila, let me start with you, so we can hear your voice again, and then I'll turn to the others.
So, Alison, did you call on me?
Yes.
Yes. It seems face and voice are both visible and audible together. So apologies for what happened before, but is experiencing messages all morning. Anyway, so power relations, I mean, one has to point out that this goes back to Pierre Benoit's question towards the end of his slide about the role of the state, because in the countries that the four of us either hail from or live in or have studied, that represents quite a spectrum. And in those countries, the question of power, both in the sense of energy and in the sense of governmental power, it's not organized in the same way. So France, for instance, is widely considered to have a kind of statist approach to its policymaking and is very centralized. And by contrast, the US federal system is highly decentralized in a variety of ways. And the degree of separation in policy between the military uses of nuclear power and the civilian has been very different across these countries, partly depending on the degree of centralization in the government, partly depending on other features of the politics of the countries. So the question who has the power cannot be answered independently of context. So that's one piece of the answer. I mean, that is what kind of state matters, not what is state up to, what is its relationship, how does it manage the defense side of things in relation to the civil society well-being side of things. And even the UK and the US often represent a radical contrast and not a similarity in these respects. The second piece of it, which I think all of us have alluded to, is that there's a separate kind of power that is not sort of constitutionally thought about in our political theories, and that is the power of expertise. And STS has a lot to say about how expertise itself becomes powerful through what kinds of moves. So, for instance, Benham both talked about risk assessment and probabilistic risk assessment, which means a quantification, and it means a move to particular kinds of expertise. So, for instance, in the nuclear debate in America, it's being that many more people die in coal mining than have ever died in the nuclear industry, and measured by numbers, severity of harm, magnitude of harm, it's manifestly the case that coal mining has produced more illnesses, more deaths than nuclear, even taking account of the nuclear accidents. However, that really denies a variety of other things as having any significance. So in the US, for instance, there was a Supreme Court decision that for instance, the psychological impacts of restarting 3 Mile Island didn't have to be considered under the National Environmental Policy Act. So at one level, you can say, okay, fine, that was a Supreme Court decision and it's about an interpretation of the law. But I think it fits with a political culture in which certain things are considered to be fuzzy, outside the bounds of expertise, not measurable, and hence you don't have to consider them. And this is a point that I think both Pierre Benoit and Andy have made in various ways, along with Benham and me, that the ways in which you construct expertise put some issues on the table and other issues not. So there is a power floating around in that very set of moves about which kinds of expertise are at the table or not. And I think the society challenges is in breaking down the barriers that disable people in the more technical fields from talking to the people who are representing the, there's even a kind of hierarchy in the vocabulary. I mean, one talks about hard science and soft science. I, who do a quote soft science unquote, but come from a background in mathematics stuff, think that soft science is actually very hard. I mean, it relates back to people and their experiences. So I think there's those two kinds of power, of conventional little theory, state government type of power that varies across countries, but also this more tacit, more ill-defined, but very real power of the way that expertise is constructed in the world.
Right. Two comments, and I'll turn to Andy next. I wonder about the US, Sheila, because I think actually nuclear is much more centralized. The power about it is more centralized in the US relative to power on other things in the US, which is more decentralized, in part because of the Atomic Energy Act, which takes a lot of leeway away from the states. But anyway, that's a small aside. But I completely agree about the power of expertise. And another example, you talked about PRA, and it's important what is counted in probabilistic risk assessments and in these events. And with Fukushima, you often hear about that accident, oh, nobody died, or very few people were killed, and the only people who died were the ones who evacuated, and so it wasn't such a bad accident. Well, that's true if you only count dead people, and that's your only unit of measure. But if you actually look at economic impact or loss of livelihood or loss of community, obviously the accident had a huge impact. And I think what we'll get into soon, because I want to talk about the public and public knowledge and the deficit model next, but let's keep with this one. People know that.
Alison, just on the first point, I mean, of course, you're right that nuclear energy, even in the states, has been more centralized than some things, but it's still possible for one state with a small population like Nevada, on the one hand, to be designated as a site, but on the other hand, to summon up enough blockage energy to keep Yucca Mountain from being a place of that it's not on the Biden agenda. I mean, so, there's ways in which federalism in the US bites back. And, living through the COVID crisis, of course, we're reminded that other countries have a much easier time pulling together a national policy than we do. And I think it's not irrelevant. I mean, I grew up during the era of the Clamshell Alliance in New England. And, and then I went to Ithaca, where, there had been a plan to construct a nuclear power plant. I mean, admittedly, they didn't consider the risks of trying to build a nuclear power plant in a place with a major university and hugely environmentalist population. But I mean, it's an object lesson in non-communication. And I guess that's the point that I want to stress, that, it's not that the social science is some airy-fairy stuff that's sitting somewhere far away. I mean, my classics of reading should be read by everybody who's interested in this set of issues. And I do think that the federalism point does rear its head in America in all kinds of ways.
Great. Andy.
Yeah, thanks for the really important question, Alison, and to Sheila for the background there. And building on what Sheila said, the last remark about, social science can tend to be sometimes seen or pejoratively mischaracterized as airy-fairy. There is nothing more hard and concrete and real than power. And it is absolutely true, as Sheila has said, that it comes in many different forms, very different. It's so important to attend to context, national context, other kinds of context, and power comes in many different channels in every context. So it's easy to become a little bit bamboozled by the complexities, but the way I refer to it, and I think we're all referring to it in relation to these issues broadly, is about asymmetries. These choices between alternative, zero carbon, low carbon technological trajectories that we're facing, the committee is looking at here as part of the backdrop to the nuclear focus, they are not subject to symmetrical momentum from structure or from agency. All the different flavors it comes in, power is asymmetric. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just means, like science itself, science is developed in ways that are worthy of enormous respect to deal with the inevitability of power, albeit imperfectly, through peer review, through openness, through transparency. But if we don't actually speak of power itself, then not only are we not being rigorous, we're also endangering some of the principles that Pierre Benoit talked about with respect to democracy. So my point is, when we see a framing, as tends to be the case across many different current nuclear countries, of framing debates like this one in terms of what can nuclear do rather than what would be best, then we are seeing these asymmetries in play. That doesn't mean nuclear is therefore to be discounted. It just means let's try to balance out, let's be more rigorous about the issues and the questions, because the way we ask questions in science, as in wider society, can actually shape the answers we get back. So let's be as rigorous about the questions as the answers. And that's why I say we need to attend to power inside science and technology.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely on that, Andy. Okay, Pierre Benoit or Benem, did you want to weigh in on this topic?
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, Benem?
I think Annie and Sheila have said important, most important stuff.
Okay, and I see we're beginning to collect some questions. I'm gonna hold off on them because I have a few more questions I want to ask the panel and to continue discussion. Oh, and Andy, one more thing. You talked about how power. You've disappeared. There you are. How power. It's important to see faces, even though I can't see you in person.
Sorry, I'm attending to a rather animated chat line and didn't want you to see my face close up. It's not that pleasant.
Okay. So anyway, I think if we don't speak about power, we are complicit with the power relations that exist.
Yes, inadvertently, yes. It's perfectly possible to be complicit inadvertently with the best of motives and yet nonetheless be part of these asymmetries I mentioned.
Yeah. So let me turn to another issue, which I think is important, and I know you all have a lot of expertise on, and I think would be really helpful for the panel to hear about, for the committee to hear about, and that is public knowledge or lack thereof, or not, on these issues. And Sheila, you mentioned in your remarks the deficit model. I think it's really important for the committee to hear more about the deficit model and to understand some of the implications of that. And I know the other three of you have a lot to say on this as well. So Sheila, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn to you again and to start us off on this discussion, and then I'll turn to the others.
Thanks. So first of all, to give proper credit, the deficit model label was coined by my esteemed colleague, Brian Wynn, who is not on this panel, but he was referring to a very generic point about social science and society, that we walk around with models of what the rest of the world is like, including people in it. And technical experts in particular have a sense of the rest of the public. For one thing, they refer to the public indiscriminately as a singular thing, the public. And what has grown up in the 20th century and carried over into the 21st is a sense that specialization of knowledge gives you a handle that allows you to look on the rest of the world and consider it to be in deficit. That is not knowing enough or not knowing supposed to know about the things that the experts know. Moreover, this has been specialized yet further in a series of statements that many experts hold, that it's in quantitative thinking and reasoning that the public is particularly in deficit. So probabilities, people don't understand the difference between 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million, or a 100-year event, or all these different kinds of things that obviously are centrally important to probabilistic risk analysis. So the STS and societal comeback, I mean, it's worth pointing out that STS scholars are only noting, I mean, we are scientists too in that sense. We're noting what is happening in society. It's not a sort of made up gloss overlaid on the world. So what this body of scholarship has noted is that people are often talking about completely different things. I mean, so, experts in the sense that I described may believe correctly even that people don't understand the difference between 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000. But if you talk to what the people are worried about, that is often not the thing that they're worried about. And so to characterize somebody as being in deficit always has to be put in a relational way. In deficit in relation to what? But if the in relation to what is not what the public really wants to know, then it's not